agricultural management, our agricultural lands can actually be wildlife habitat. And rather ironically for some of us, there are a lot of people in conservation biology who do not believe that agricultural land is of much value to wildlife in any way, shape, or form. And if you have that mindset, then out of field management ends up being, you're pigeonholed in that direction. The concept of private land obviously is important because most farmland is private in the US and UK. Set aside, which of course is a long history in the United States dating back into the 30s or even earlier, where in the UK, set aside is not really something they talk about very much. Farm subsidies, which occurs in both places, just in different forms, and things like public trust doctrine. And the thing to remember, the big difference between the United States and England, when I show you the next couple of slides, is that game animals, birds and mammals like deer in the UK are privately owned by the landowner. So a landowner owns that wildlife, sort of like South Africa and things like zebras in South Africa. They're privately owned because it's British sort of mentality. Whereas in the United States, wildlife is considered public trust doctrine. That means that we own the wildlife. The landowner does not own the wildlife. So create some different ways to think about it. Okay, so I'm going to give you a quick history of the United Kingdom in like 1 minute. You were supposed to laugh, but no, I didn't see anybody smile even. Now you are. Now you're getting that I was really telling a joke. Okay, the UK has a lot of agriculture like we do in the United States, and it has changed a lot in the last 100 years or so. Remember during the Victorian era, which would have been the first, which would have encompassed that first map of the UK, think about the Victorian era as the last vestiges of the British Empire, or the peak of the British Empire, and then the last vestiges of the British Empire, where an awful lot of what they consumed in the UK was coming from other places that were part of the realm. And so old Blighty, there wasn't that much pressure on the UK to actually do things like produce food at commercial scales. And so you had a lot of agriculture. It's an agricultural country. But think about an awful lot of the agricultural, a lot of resources coming in from elsewhere. They talk about the Holland fallacy in modern country richness. That's sort of the same idea. And then you see 1935, a little bit of change, actually a decrease in agriculture during the early part of the 20th century. But then all of a sudden you see this flip to a lot more agriculture in the 1970s and on into the 1990s. And most of that is not agricultural land coming into production. It's just grazing land going from grassland to annual cropland is what you see down at the bottom part of the map there. And that is a result of World War II. World War II is a key time in British history. They had a fairly rough time during the war, obviously. We were sort of way out on the sidelines here in the United States, and we were able to ship resources and people over for the war, but it wasn't in our backyard. And what World War II highlighted to the British was that, oh, we didn't do things very well, because now all of a sudden, our agricultural production is wrecked, what little we had, and we're kind of starving here, and all our trade routes and everything else are gone. We're really hungry. And so right after World War II, they created something called the Agricultural Act of 1947. And so what they did in that fell swoop is a number of things that basically embedded in British law that they would no longer be food dependent on others. And so if you think about this small country with a lot of people, way higher human population density than we have in the United States, and less really good farmland, they basically made a decision that they were going to have to do something about their farmland. And that act of 1947 basically said, we are going to produce what we need in this country, both from crop production and animal production, agriculture. And so between, if you look at the statistics there from 1938 to 1939 and then to 1951, you have about, what, 15 years there where agricultural value went from 2.5 million pounds to more than 100 million pounds. And which means that basically the British went from old-fashioned American pre-World War II style agriculture to modern agriculture that jumped way ahead of almost everybody else in the world. This went to seriously intensive agriculture. We talk about intensification of agriculture after World War II. It was not in the same scales as the UK. One just sort of highlight of that is the graph in the upper left here showing this is nationwide wheat yield in the UK in metric tons per hectare of wheat. You're talking about by the 1980s, 1990s, we're talking about on a normal year having 7 or 8 metric tons per hectare. That, you know, multiply that by 37 and you're starting to get into the vicinity of conversions to American style agriculture. That's a lot of wheat being produced. I was shocked the first time I went to the UK and they took me to some of their study areas and I could not walk through wheat fields because the wheat was so thick. It was heading out at the time and it was amazing, but you could smell the agricultural chemicals on it because of course it's intensification of agriculture. And that gets back to this extensification versus intensification. So I want to point out, after World War II, Britain said, we don't have much land area to bring into production. We have some, but how we're going to do it is we're going to extract far, far more agricultural commodities out of a hectare of land than we ever have in our past. And so they basically went from sort of having the same kinds of levels of production per hectare or acre that everybody else was doing to jumping way ahead. But it came at a cost. That cost was what was then an agricultural or farmland byproduct, and that was wildlife. And as it turns out, my friends at the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust work on game birds, and their main constituency group are the estate owners in England, who are mostly farmers, who like to shoot partridge and pheasants and things like that. It's got a long history, dating very much heyday was in the Victorian era. And ironically, this is what I did my PhD on, was the gray partridge, which also lives in the United States. It was introduced to the United States like pheasants were. And I did my work in North Dakota. So that's how I got hooked up with these guys. And so there was a guy there who worked for the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust who was hired. And the trust was looking at why there was such a decline in gray partridge abundance. And you can see this graph here. And remember, before 1960, these abundances were already much higher than what's shown on this graph. This decline was already well underway in the 1950s, came during that time of agricultural and intensification. Originally, when Dick Potts was hired at the Game Conservancy Trust back in the 60s, they were all thinking, oh, this is pesticides killing partridge. Must be pesticides killing the wildlife. Well, most of the pesticides being used early on were herbicides. There were some insecticides being used, and actually they got banned pretty quickly because they did find direct toxicity effects. But what Dick Potts and his buddies figured out is that things like herbicides didn't really have a negative direct impact on birds like gray partridge. What herbicides did in agricultural fields is they changed the ecosystem. This is an ecosystem. And the ecosystem went from being wheat and a whole bunch of weeds underneath the wheat to wheat and nothing else. And so when you have gray partridge chicks, which are quite insectivorous, yeah, you can kill them with insecticides, the insects with insecticides. But what's more insidious, which is harder to measure, is the impact of herbicides. So they started using herbicides quite intensively then, took out all these rare arable wildflowers, better known as weeds, which removed the habitat for beneficial insects, insects that are food insects for gray partridge. And basically what Dick showed was that chick survival rates dropped from like 50 or 60% to down to under 30%. And they have sort of a 30% threshold in the UK. If gray partridge chick survival drops under 30%, you're probably going to have a population decline. And so what he was able to model, and there's a lot of science and more than 50 years of data that they've been collecting on this, that basically showed that a huge impact of the intensification of agriculture starting after World War II in the UK was the spraying of herbicides and then insecticides also, that reduced agricultural field weeds, that reduced insects, that then had the knock-on effect of indirect effects on gray partridge survival. You add a whole range of other kinds of impacts, which Dick has modeled over the years, relating to predation, removal of hedgerows, all the nesting cover and things like that. It's very important. But what Dick said is that, okay, we've identified a problem here. Well, the industrial engineering solution is to fix the problem. Well, if you think about a country in which set-aside is not really available, and so, which we've had as a crutch for an awful long time in the United States, that we could set land aside and let partridge live in set-aside land. Well, they didn't have that available. We could just tell folks to not spray fields, which of course, their constituency group are farmers. They can't do that. Well, how do we work in a modern landscape and try to create an ecosystem once again? And so what Dick and actually Nick Southerton, because it was Nick Southerton who invented and he's been here to Lincoln, was the one who invented one of the management tools that's now been widely applied in Europe, in the UK and Europe. We get to the next slide here, hopefully. Oh, it's going to make me do it this way. Okay. Making space for biodiversity in agricultural fields. This is the original precision agriculture. This is pre-GPS, pre-continuous monitoring of pesticides, continuous monitoring of harvest. This is where folks just used a lot of creative thinking and plot trials in a lot of places to figure out that agricultural fields are not all created equal. And so what Nick said, and Nick is an entomologist by training, and he said that, well, we already know, and they did a lot of work, is that these areas around the margins of fields are not very good at producing high wheat yields. And we can sacrifice a little bit more of that wheat yield if we ask the farmers to turn off certain kinds of pesticide use. And I'm not going to get into all the details on what those are, because they still allow some pesticide use in those areas, but turn off some of it, mainly herbicides, which allows the field to look like this photo, which are all poppies, obviously annual field poppies, which in the UK is an important wildflower in rural areas. And there's a whole range of others, and they actually have a whole program now on rare arable wildflowers, and they actually now also call this pollinator habitat, and because that's the terminology everybody likes to use. So Nick's starting to invent this in the 1970s. He's coming up with a solution for farmers to say, okay, so we can't change the way we do our management of fields. We don't really have the opportunity for set aside. Let's take those narrow strips around the edge of fields and turn it into gray partridge brood habitat, which they did. And when they started putting these fields in around the UK, what they found is that immediately gray partridge chick survival significantly increased. So it was obvious that there was a connection to pesticide use, but then a solution which had very, very minimal impacts on the agricultural production of each of these fields, because they were concentrating it on those areas of the field that had lower production anyways. The second thing that they worked on, which I think has been pretty useful in a European context, have been beetle banks. Again, not every field has lots of hedgerows, and a lot of fields are very large now. How do we make ecosystems in agricultural fields that allow the farmer to continue farming his field, but maybe contribute to his ability to lower his pesticide use, especially insecticides, by taking advantage of ecosystem services of things called beetle banks, putting grassy hedges through the middle of fields, which produce nesting cover for birds, but at the same time produce an awful lot of predatory beetles that will allow those predatory beetles to go out into the adjacent agricultural fields and eat things like wheat aphids and so on. And so it reduces the impact of taking that tiny bit of land out of production by reducing input costs along the way. And so, again, we're not talking about changing modern agriculture, but we're talking about incorporating some ecosystem systems ecology thinking into the way we do intensive management. And so you start thinking about this very small NGO with a fairly narrow focus. They were able to come up with a couple of important techniques. And these are just two examples. They've been doing these sorts of things in a wide range of agricultural context in the UK for decades. But I wanted to just point out those two, that it doesn't always come down to these sort of engineering solutions to fix individual problems, but instead to think about systems approaches. And so Dick Potts spent 50 years working on gray partridge, and one of his big study areas was the South Downs in Sussex. And I think Larkin maybe has been over there. It's being carried on. Dick recently died of pancreatic cancer, still working when he hit 80 years old, still doing his partridge research, and unfortunately the cancer got him. It's been a mentor for me for my whole career, right from my PhD on to the year he died. For a long time, a lot of people in the UK said, well, you've come up with all these ideas and it seems to work here and there, but it hasn't restored gray partridge. And even your core study area, partridge have not done extremely well. And what Dick, after he retired, got the farmers in the South Downs to agree to was to work as sort of a pod of landowners to implement all of these kinds of management tools that they had developed and use it as a demonstration site to show that you could put all of these pieces together and do something good for conservation, but not wreck your farming at the same time. And so I'm going to show you one slide here at the end, which is just a photo of part of South Downs. And all of a sudden these things, you're probably looking at my error message from this silly stuff from, there we go. I can't get it to get rid of that. Can you guys see that? Are you looking at my error message on my screen? Yeah, sorry. Okay, so I can't get my mouse to go over there to get rid of it. It seems to be locked up on my other screen. Sorry about that. Okay, but what you can do is you're going to look at these two maps. This is part of South Downs. This is an area south of London, very agricultural area in the UK. This is the famous Sussex study area where Dick Potts did work for 50 years and has been carrying on since then. The little red circles there on the left map are all the gray partridge coveys. These birds like to live in little coveys like quail here in the United States that were found there in about 2003 before they started implementing all of the different management tools that Dick and his colleagues, Nick Southerton, John Hull, and a whole bunch of other folks put together. By the time they got to 2010, that was the right-hand map. That's the change in abundance of that one species on these study areas. And each of those dots actually represents a covey of birds. So the larger circles there are probably 15, 20 birds. And so you can see that each of those circles represents a very large or a pretty good sized number of birds. So there's a lot of birds on that area. What they've also demonstrated that a lot of rare arable wildflowers are returning very much in those areas. British love their butterflies. A lot of rare British butterflies made huge recoveries on these areas. And now they've spent a lot of time working on pollinators to extend these kinds of ideas to that. And so what I guess what I'm trying to get at here is that modern ag science has a lot to offer to us. We have more production per acre and a lot more acres that can be put into production than we ever have in history. We're going to have 10 billion people on this planet in the next 30 years. But if we only look for engineering and especially reductionist approaches to fix all the problems that we might have in an agricultural field or on a farm, we're probably going to find ourselves in the same boat that the British have found themselves in the 20th century and are still in a lot of cases. And we have a very small group of people. This organization is smaller than School of Natural Resources, yet has a national impact on farm policy, farm management, and have, by embracing ecologists into thinking about how we do farm management, it's changed the way they think about producing crops that we need versus all of the other ecosystem services that we have out there. And so with that, that's all I wanted to give you a background on. And so I think it's hopefully some food for thought for everybody. In that that QR code in the bottom there, if you take your phone and you just take a picture of that, that takes you to a link that gives you all the details on that big Sussex study area that that Potts worked on for 50 years. Okay, so
that's awesome, John. Thank you very much for presenting. This is really intriguing, especially tied in a lot of the stuff I'm focused on with precision conservation. So I think, as we kind of, spend the next, almost 30 minutes, what I want to do is, very similar to what I outlined in the email, is I want to make this more of a conversation, like you're sitting around with your friends at a coffee shop chatting about ideas. I think John outlined some, really great points in thinking about even some of the challenges that we face and how can we work towards implementing conservation more strategically in the United States, in Nebraska, more specifically. And so I'll kind of open the floor up and just let folks, throw out your ideas. And John, if you want to jump in as well and provide your thoughts and kind of go from there.
Thanks, Andy.
Yep.
Powell must have some ideas, unless he wasn't paying attention. All I see is his kudu.
Well, I'll throw out I guess, how much, John, do you think that the impact of that, the trust in England has been, or throughout the UK really, to some of their, like you showed the example at the end of that local landscape that they did targeted management on, and you could obviously see the difference. I guess, so it makes me think of extension type experimental plots and landscapes. And I get there's a lot of folks on this call from various conservation groups here. And I just wonder if one solution for us is to think about all chumming up together on some local, what kind of things can we do on some local landscapes in various parts of the state to work together to do some example things like that landowners can see.
Well, I think that's actually a good key point, because one of the things that seems to be missing in North America in general is, you think about the Sussex study area where they've been working since the 1960s on the same place, and they have a monitoring program, very intensive monitoring program on everything from agriculture to conservation issues relating to things like rare butterflies and birds and everything else. And you look at it, say in the Southeast, where Tall Timbers Research Station, and you look down in Texas, or Oklahoma, and some of the really long-term research stations. And historically, there's been some biological stations in the United States have done those sorts of things. But I can't think of any, the Noble Foundation has done a little bit in Oklahoma. Andy has some experience with them, but not very many good examples of where people have tried to put together, and I know we've talked about it in INR, the farm of the future that would incorporate these sorts of things as a demonstration. Demonstration is huge for the Game Conservancy because they don't have base funding. They have to demonstrate to their constituents, who are farmers and members, that what they're arguing works and doesn't break the bank. And so I think that that's how they've proceeded with all of the work that they do in showing that they can, you have trade-offs, but you can recoup some of those costs through other kinds of income streams and so on. I think there's a lot of value there, but I think, to me, what's more important about what they did is they changed thinking about how you look at agricultural fields. Instead of looking at the agricultural field as a net negative, they looked at it as an opportunity to do something. And if you think about it, when they really got going, and I used to talk to Dick about this all the time, 98% of the conservation biologists in the UK work on 2% of the land area, because they all want to work on nature reserves, which is about 2% of the land area UK, on the rare species that occur in nature reserves. That's great. Excuse me, nothing wrong with that. But then it created this mentality that somehow the 76% of the UK that's farmland is not even worth thinking about. And if you actually look at the most recent surveys of farm wildlife in the UK, done by like the BTO, British Trust for Ornithology, they're talking about how important agricultural land is for wildlife conservation. And that, well, maybe we need to be doing something about that. Well, this is something that these guys were doing starting in the 1960s. And so they're a little bit behind the times, but at least catching up. So it's this mindset change that, it's not a loss, that an agricultural field, a cornfield or a wheat field, can be looked at as wildlife habitat. Not the same way as a grass field, but it is land area that can be useful and occupied.
John, I have a question. In the UK, are producers, do they have large tracts of land like they do here, or are farms smaller?
Yeah, farms are shockingly large in the UK. Most of the farmers that I work with, they're farming anywhere from, anywhere from 500 to, I know some guys who have 30, 40,000 acres.
And are those larger producers, are they incorporating this into their operations, or is it the smaller producers, or a little bit of everyone?
It's a little bit of everything, and it's highly variable depending on the part of the country and so on, and what other management goals they have. The good thing that the Game Conservancy did early on was they have a membership base, and which is interesting because it's about 25,000. I think it's a little bigger than that now. But if you actually looked at their membership and what land area of the UK they either own or control as a manager or as a state owner, farm owner, it's something like somewhere around 80% of the land area, farmland area of the UK is represented in their membership, which is pretty darn good. But that's also, starting at World War II, setting all the stage for that kind of engagement. And it's highly variable as to how much people adopt. It ranges from nothing to all in, like the Sussex study area, where they made the decision because of their personal relationship with Dick to go in as a whole group of landowners to join together and demonstrate that they can do things a lot better. And so, yeah, it's some overlap here, and but also some some differences, because they can also generate some income from things like hunting on their properties too, because hunting there is all privately controlled. So you can make an income from hunting. Unfortunately for them, pheasants were a distraction, because rearing pheasants became a big thing in the UK. And so you don't have to do as much on the ground if you're releasing pheasants as you would if you're trying to wild manage them. And so one of the things I started when I was there as the manager for pheasants in the UK was convince people, which some people bought into, that wild pheasants were worth more than reared pheasants. And, and actually a lot of people have bought into that. And a lot of people have decided that, yeah, shooting a whole bunch of reared pheasants is not nearly as much fun psychologically as shooting a few really wild birds that you've done a good job managing a property to have.
So John, I'm curious, when we're thinking about some of the challenges here in the United States and kind of connecting that to the UK. So one of the things that in my discussions with, producers and various other stakeholders in Nebraska comes back to a lot of it is issues with taxes, property taxes, and, and communities relying on those property taxes from their farmers. And obviously if you take and, give tax credits or basically tax breaks in a sense to adopt certain conservation practices, then you maybe would lose some of that revenue stream and you'd have to come up with it elsewhere. Just kind of thinking about the issues over there, what do you foresee as are ways here in Nebraska that we could, overcome some of those challenges? And I pose that as kind of a challenging question because I'm not, I don't think there is any, one right answer yet. So maybe there's never a right answer, but what are some of those potential options to get over those barriers?
Well, one of the things that, because we do have a lot of farm programs and, a lot of opportunities through all of the various farm programs. And of course, now the private sector's involved in a lot of those too. Pheasants Forever done a fantastic job with that. But I think that one of the problems that we tend to do is we tend to still be stuck in that mentality of, although it's getting better now, finally, that somehow you have to take the land out of production in order to make it wildlife habitat. And that, or you set aside the parts of the land that don't produce crops very well and make that your wildlife habitat, instead of thinking more broadly about how we can do those things, plus take advantage of that huge chunk of land that is a crop field and not necessarily create, pristine wildlife habitat, but how do we make it better or less of a net negative? And which I think it takes it's a little harder for people to get their heads around, because people get annoyed when you start spending conservation money to help somebody grow a crop field. People do get annoyed about that. But in my mind, I don't see the conflict. You're starting to see that here, which we were very well ingrained with when I lived in Georgia, and Andy's familiar with this, cover crops. By the time Andy was in Georgia, the cover crops were everywhere. I mean, not everybody was using, but some counties were using cover crops on, conservation tillage and cover crops on 80% plus of the farmland. And yet there was a recent innovation. And if you think about it from a wildlife conservation point of view, that makes the field a lot better. Because if you think about some of the things that Dick and Nick and those guys came up with, it was plant diversity in the field that was really a fundamental issue that got taken away by the post-World War II intensification of agriculture. Dick used to like to talk about the old Russian system, those huge, 100,000 acre fields in Russia during the wheat era. And people would say, well, that's terrible because, and he'd say, yeah, actually it wasn't, because they were managed so poorly. Sorry if anybody hears Russian. They were managed so poorly that they were actually great ecosystems, because they had the wheat in those fields in fairly low yields, but they had all kinds of wildflowers in them, and broadleafs that supported very diverse insect communities, and that were great for a whole range of different species of wildlife, even though the fields were 100,000 acres. They were just substituting one kind of step for another, I think.
John, you might have mentioned it already, but you were talking about programs and incentives, or maybe it was Andy that's talking about incentives. So I think that's, that's where my mind is right now, at this, what you've talked about. Were there incentives in the UK then, or what were the incentives? I guess there, depends what we mean by incentives. But for, these differing practices, what was driving that change of?
Yeah, there are both private incentives and public incentives in Europe in general. And remember that this idea of set aside and that sort of thing is a much more recent phenomenon. They learned that from us. I mean, in the US, we, remember if you go back to the 20s and 30s and soil bank, all those early conservation programs or set aside programs, a lot of it, the crux was to reduce production. And Europe, has had some of that, but generally not for much of the 20th century, where they worried about reducing crop production to bump up prices. So that's a much more recent phenomena, to have agricultural products that set aside land in the EU. I mean, that came along sort of in the 80s and 90s, really, where we've had it since the 20s and 30s. And so that's a different sort of incentive. But the part of the 1947 Farm Bill in the UK, the Agricultural Act, was that they would not starve, which means that they would not financially have farmers go out of business. So the thing to remember about UK farming is that they were highly subsidized to do that intensification of agriculture. And so it's also then easy to add on conservation measures, as we did with the 1985 Farm Bill in the United States, where finally some serious conservation measures were added to government subsidies of agriculture. But one of the things that the Europeans did early on was have their ag programs much more diversified than in the United States. Remember, common agricultural policy in the EU covers all of Europe, which is all the different kinds of agriculture ranging from, Mediterranean to Scandinavia. And so they had to incorporate a lot more variation in the kinds of agriculture they were dealing with than even we have in the United States. And so I think the mindset there was much more towards conservation being important, for one, right from the beginning, where it had to be introduced along the way here. And secondly, that thinking about subsidizing a farmer to put certain kinds of crops in over other kinds of crops was not an anathema. I think that in the US, if our government paid farmers in Nebraska to grow wheat on their property, a couple fields of wheat instead of corn and soybeans everywhere, people would freak out from a conservation point of view, but it actually might be really good from a conservation point of view, because often wheat mixed into these ecosystems works very nicely for wildlife conservation. But I think that a lot of conservation people will go, well, we can't be paying them to grow crops. And I'm going, well, they're not growing so much corn.
Yeah, well, that was kind of where my mind was too, linked with some of, Andy's work on precision conservation. Is there a landscape where that would be, I see Dana, if there's a wetland landscape where cover crops would, or a landscape with enough interspersion of grass where that give it that little bit of, diversity to have more bang for the buck there. But like you said, it's another conversation about conservation.
Well, and I think that Andy's on the right track. There's no arguing there, because I think that's the same thing. When I was working with John Holland back in the 1990s, that's exactly what he was doing. He was trying to identify those parts of agricultural fields that were a bit of a wash, and that could be maybe used for other purposes, or you do other kinds of management, because you don't want to be if you're putting huge inputs into an agricultural field to get a couple hundred bushels per acre of wheat, you don't want to be putting it on places where you're never going to get that anyway. So you're just wasting money. The problem back then is they didn't have the technology to help them then translate that to a farm, to the farmer use, because they were able to show that. But then, you know, without GPS, I mean, remember, when I was working there, we didn't even have GPS. And so, you know, and there was not continuous monitoring of harvest and things like that. So they had significant technology limitations. I think that they're well set up to implement what we call precision farming very, very nicely, and translate that to precision conservation. Because I think that they also have a mindset that they're much more flexible. Remember, conservation reserve here has some limitation, or historically had limitations on flexibility, where you couldn't just set a little plot in the middle of a field away as set aside. It just wasn't really it couldn't cope historically with the way our ag programs were set up. Aisha, you're either on mute or we're not here. Oh, there you go.
Well, okay. Sorry, I have two monitors. Maybe I was too far. Just curiosity, I'm wondering how much remote sensing is being used to monitor the habitat over time. You know, just looking at the maps, you know, the data collection has been there a long time ago, but you know, how much they are utilizing either UAVs, airplane, satellite, you know.
I think they're doing all, yeah. I think they're all doing the same sorts of things that we're doing here. And it's just highly variable and hit or miss depending on what the context is in the application. And I think that we're all in the same boat on that one. And I think that, you know, obviously you're thinking remote sensing. I think that remote sensing is going to be the cornerstone of all of this. And you know, the bottom line being, how do we utilize that technology properly so that it's not just an engine? Sorry, Aisha, but yeah, I know you're an engineer, but you know, so we don't come up with just a technical engineering solution, that we actually integrate technical engineering solutions with ecosystem approaches or ecology approaches to managing these systems, which I think is the way we're going to get this to work in the future.
Thank you.
Yeah, I actually, that's a really good question or point, because I've talked to Dan and E about this a little bit, particularly thinking about evaluation of our conservation programs that are out there, the existing programs in the landscape, and can we, you know, with AI technologies, machine learning, be able to automate some of that with remote sensing imagery and make it so that, you know, you don't necessarily have to send somebody out to the field and, you know, evaluate compliance, non-compliance and such. I think that's an area that there's a lot of interest in. I don't really know many folks that are really diving into that yet. I think it's kind of a new area of interest, but yeah, I think it's a great idea. So what other comments, questions? We got a few more minutes before we wrap up here for the hour. For John, or just John, any parting thoughts or ideas?
Yeah, well, unless somebody else is going to jump in, I'll jump in. Couple things. That article on the Sussex study is a really pretty neat one on the historical evolution of modern agriculture in a UK context, and how to integrate ecosystem kinds of conservation thinking into it. And but I think that my bottom line with all of this is think outside the box. You know, I think that in the US we've used agricultural programs, especially set aside conservation reserve, as a crux to avoid having some more difficult conversations. And it doesn't mean I think that conservation reserve is bad. I think it's really good, but if we just proceed thinking that's going to solve our problems, then we're in for a rude awakening.
You know, one of the things that as you're talking, a couple of things, how much ecology is taught in the agronomy courses that the kids go through in our colleges. I mean, I'm asking because I don't know. I haven't gone through an agronomist program, but it would seem that we just got done working with a capstone class on a project up here. And when you talk about Haney test or any of the new biological stuff, that's all new information. They were like, how do you spell that? They just haven't heard it. So I think, is sometimes these things have to come into favor a little bit before they get changed at the universities. But the other thing, I work in more of a water quality area, dealing with some surface water and stuff. But, when I came from Colorado, so I had to learn everything about, the area up here and stuff. And it's just every one of those things is tied together. And you had mentioned that the personal relationship with the researcher there in the UK was kind of what drove those producers to kind of jump in and start doing this. I don't have any relationships with any of the producers in the area that I'm working in. So if you're going to jump into that, what do you think would be a driver to get those producers to come together and start thinking outside the box?
Well, it comes back to trust. I know some of the extension folks here talk about trust, and it's those are things that take time and effort. Anytime I've worked in my career in private land management, the first thing, of course, being a wildlife biologist, you go work in agricultural areas, and a lot of the farmers are just like, oh God, another one. But I used, when I was doing field work, I'd go out and help them with calving. I'd go out and, there were lots of times when I was out in the field and nobody else was, where I'd see, cows dropping their calves in the wrong place. And I'd go knock on the door and tell them, we gotta, you gotta save a calf here and that sort of thing. And, help them with that sort of things. I think made a big difference on working relationships, that you're not there to just tell them what to do. But, and because a lot of them are vested in the long term in that piece of property too. So, but there's pressures in all directions. And so they don't always, from my view, don't always do the right thing, but that doesn't make them bad people either.
Andy, do you have time for one more comment, or are you full for today?
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Neil.
Hey, I just want to, I'm Neil Dominy. I work for NRCS here in Nebraska. And I think John's perspective on, economics is really important, and adaptation to change is challenging. And I work with a lot of farmers from the 40-acre farmer brother I have, as well as all the way up to the multi-thousand-acre farmers. And I think it's interesting too, as you think about precision ag, is that, a 40-acre, 200-acre farmer, they might be willing to run a program. They might be willing to run something right down the middle of their operation. It's a beautiful addition from an ecological benefit, wildlife benefit. And then you get into the larger acre farmers where they know they have spots on their farm that they're not growing a dang thing, but they're not willing to slow down and change their enterprise or economic direction, because slowing down costs them time. But that's where John's idea of bigger scales. So, could you get wheat into the rotation? Could there be a program to pay the difference between corn production to wheat production?
Yeah.
The government just pays the difference. Let them grow a full quarter of wheat,
Yep.
and make their money similar in the end. I think there's lots of opportunity out there, but I think that's one of the key things in my mind, is I think the conversation changes as you look at the enterprise of that particular producer. So just 2 cents. Good presentation, John.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. That's a really good point. And thinking about diversification, and I think kind of your idea ties back into what Larkin's original question and comment was in regards to the thinking about experimental areas that we can do some of this. I think we had some other grants here recently where we were putting money in the to basically help offset those costs that farmers basically taking out a section of their field to put it into an alternative practice, so they weren't risking losing that income on the field. And so, it's a great idea from a research standpoint, but then from the longevity of that, thinking about how can we, have maybe some demonstration places that are maybe even beyond just our typical, research and extension centers. Again, they're great sources, but even potential farms where we can have these kind of like landscape level perspectives and looking at patch diversity and density and how all that affects the overall impacts on water and soil and wildlife, et cetera. So I think it's a really good perspective. All right. Well, thanks again, everybody. I really appreciate everybody taking time. Thanks again, John, for being our first speaker for the Coffee and Conservation Hour. And we're going to continue this on into the future. I believe Larkin has volunteered. Is that correct, Larkin, for next month? We have to solidify the date on it. We will, in the new year, get a more of a reoccurring schedule set up. We figured these kind of last couple of months of the year, we wanted to kind of keep it it'll be a little different, but then eventually we'll get to the point where we'll have a recurring meeting in the future. But again, thank you so much. Really look forward to the coming conversations. Additionally, if you have anybody, you yourself as well, could even volunteer to speak. It's not wildlife centric, it's natural resources as a whole. So soil, water, wildlife, climate, et cetera. So feel free to shoot me an email if you'd be interested in being a speaker in the coming months. All right. We'll see everyone later. Thanks again. Appreciate it.